I've been issued a challenge by the cameraman to start today's episode with a word other than so. So that was my attempt at it. And moving on, we are going to be looking at power supplies today. I get a lot of personal messages on YouTube asking me for especially power supply recommendations because everyone can look up benchmarks for a video card or a CPU, and everyone can look up a price. That's easy. Okay, I need this much performance, I want to pay this much, easy, done. However, for power supply, it starts to get a little bit more complicated because there's so much misinformation out there about what kind of a power supply you need. Like, for example, you'll see specs on a CPU like 140 watts. Well, that's a TDP. That's not actually the wattage that CPU consumes from a power supply. So and then you've got a video card that might output, a 150 watt heat load, but that's watts in heat. So that's not useful for this either. So basically, I wanted to do a quick recommendation video on a basic power supply that I think is just one of the best no frills, no gimmicks power supplies out on the market. Now, these two, you'd look at them and they look pretty similar, but for power supply, all of the important stuff is what goes on under the plain metal casing. So let's start with looking at what I would call not a very solid power supply. This is what I would consider a doorstop. Okay, so there's no particular markings. You can find a rated output on here. So 18 amps total on the 12 volt rail is not very strong by today's standards. The 12 volt rail is very important, so that's part of what makes it a budget cheapo power supply. Okay, you can see that it doesn't have, this is one that I use for testing fans actually, but the actual stock connectors on it are very few. It doesn't even have a PCI Express connector because honestly, if you have a dedicated video card, you shouldn't be using a doorstop power supply. It also uses an 80mm fan for cooling, which means it's not going to be as quiet as a quality power supply, and it's not going to run as cool. So that brings us into what I believe is one of the best value power supplies on the market. This is the Seasonic SS400ET. It is a 400 watt power supply, and unless you're looking at a very basic system, 400 watts is pretty much where I would start. Now, yes, you can probably power, integrated video, AMD quad core with, a hard drive, all your standard stuff off a 250 or even 300 watt power supply, no problem. But a 400 watt power supply is going to be built a little bit better. You're going to get 80 plus bronze certification, and you also get expandability for the future. That is a big thing that I always stress when people ask me for a power supply recommendation, is that it's not always about what you're hooking up to it today. It's more about what you may need to hook up to it in the future. So you can see this one, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that you'll find on the higher end models, but what it does have is a 24-pin connector for the motherboard. It has either an 8-pin or a 4-pin connector, so you can see on a cheaper unit you might only find a 4-pin P4 connector. Okay, so that gives you the proper connectors you need for a modern motherboard. It's got proper SATA connectors, so you got 4 SATA connectors, which means you can actually add more hard drives to your system, whereas a really basic unit might only have 1 or 2 SATA connectors on it. I mean, yeah, you can use adapters, but then you're just adding more cable clutter and more inefficiencies to it. And then you've also got an adequate number of Molex connectors, as well as 1 PCI Express connector. So really, the 350 watt, 400 watt range is where you start getting into power supplies that can genuinely power a dedicated graphics card. And a 400 watt unit like this, with great efficiency, is going to be good for even up to like a mid-range video card, like a 5770. So this gets my recommendation gold star. Also, yeah, here's another thing to look at. You can see that when you start to look at a quality built power supply, you find dual 12 volt rails capable of providing up to 360 watts combined. So those 12 volt rails are almost capable of providing the full power of this power supply. That's how you can tell it's a modernly designed, well-built unit, because most modern systems are going to rely very heavily on that 12 volt rail. You also get silence. Seasonic is really known for their quiet power supplies. And you can see that even on their low-end models, they equip them with 120mm fans as well as 80 plus. 80 plus goes a long way towards making sure that this fan is not spinning really hard to get rid of excess heat from inefficiency. You got a nice efficient unit running a nice quiet 120mm fan. That's how you're going to make sure you have a good power supply experience. On the back, you've just got a standard honeycomb grill, so that's where the exhaust air is going to come out from that 120mm fan, and then you've got your standard power input, as well as an on-off switch. This is very convenient. That's another thing, again, you may not find on a low-end power supply. In order to completely cut the power off from your system with this unit, you have to pull the power cord. It's just not convenient. Like, I know you don't have to turn off the system manually at the back very often, but if you ever do, it's nice to have the switch. Just those little things are what makes buying a decent quality power supply very, very important. It also just doesn't cost that much more, and it's going to give you better reliability overall for your computer, because the power supply is often one of the first things to fail. So if you buy a good quality power supply and a good quality motherboard, that's the other big one, then you can be sure your system's going to last for a long time.